And joining me now are candidates Scott Wiener and Jane Kim to discuss their political philosophies and why they want to head to Sacramento. Welcome to both of you. What quality do you think each of you would bring that's in short supply in Sacramento?
Well, I think one, we really need a progressive voice in Sacramento. In fact, we're increasingly seeing business-friendly Democrats come up to Sacramento. And a representative from San Francisco is going to have a lot of flexibility and independence to fight for ELIS Act reforms, to fight for more affordable housing, and also to work to make higher education affordable again here throughout the state. I have a ballot measure, Proposition W, that if it passes, which I believe it will make San Francisco the first city in the nation to make community college free again for all of our residents, and that's the type of work that I want to bring up to Sacramento.
What about you? And let me just ask you if I could.
Sure.
You are openly gay, of course. Mark Leno, who is leaving the Senate, is. How important is that, do you think, to have an LGBT person from the Bay Area?
I think it's very important. Right now, we have one remaining LGBT representative from San Francisco, Mark Leno, who's termed out, and having an LGBT voice from San Francisco in the state legislature is important. Our straight allies are unbelievably important, but we have to have our own seat at the table. And I've been working for 25 years to support my community, the LGBT community. But it goes beyond that. I think even my harshest critic would acknowledge that I am tenacious. I don't just pick an issue and then get a headline and give up. I see it through till the end. So I'm going to go up to Sacramento and fight for more funding for affordable housing, for better support for transit, and to really push back when the drug companies or the insurance companies are depriving people of access to health care.
Affordability is a huge issue in San Francisco. You've alluded to the lack of housing, the lack of affordable housing. There's an issue up before the Board of Supervisors next week on Airbnb. There's now an amendment to an existing law to tighten the restrictions from 90 days to allow people to rent a room for 90 days versus 60 days. Do you support tightening that up? And what are your thoughts about how Airbnb is affecting affordability in San Francisco?
So I don't think that's the best way to describe the difference between the two legislation. There really is no limit in the initial legislation that we had written in terms of the number of nights that someone can host someone in their home as long as they live there. The problem is that there's no way for San Francisco to enforce that. How are we going to know if you are staying here on Monday night versus Wednesday night? What President Breed has introduced is a hard cap. So regardless of how many nights you sleep at your home, which we really can't determine anyway, we're saying that you can rent out your house for no longer than 60 days. Now, I'm not going to say 60 days is the right day or 90 days is the right day, but I've always pushed for a hard cap because that is the only way we can enforce that type of legislation. I actually support short-term rentals, but I really want it to be true short-term rentals.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Scott, what's your position on that?
Sure. So I've always been an advocate for good and tough regulation of short-term rentals to make sure that we are not removing entire units, entire apartment buildings from the housing stock. We should crack down on those abuses, and we have been cracking down. And I've been a supporter of better enforcement resources and mechanisms. But if someone has a spare bedroom in their house and they want to rent it out a few nights a week to generate extra income, we should allow them to do that, and we shouldn't be banning them from doing it.
San Francisco has benefited in many ways from the tech influx. There's a lot of jobs here now, people working in tech, but some people feel it's also made the affordability issue worse. Net, is the influx of tech to San Francisco a net plus or net minus?
I don't think actually the issue is the jobs that we are creating. The issue is the amount of affordable and middle income housing that we are creating. And that has always been my top priority. Well, we should be a city that can accept and absorb jobs and greater growth here in the Bay Area. But what we haven't done is we haven't adequately protected our residents and our existing tenants, which is why I fought for and authored the boldest tenant protection legislation in the country back in 2014. And we also have to make sure that when we allow market rate developers to build here in our city, because they are generating profit from our land, that we need to ask them to build more affordable and middle income housing, and that is what I fought for. We are the only city in the country that has won 40% affordable housing and middle income housing on any of our projects, and I'm proud to have negotiated every single one of those deals in the district I represent.
Yeah. Scott?
So I think singling out one industry and saying we don't want you here, we don't want headquarters here, we don't want good paying jobs here is the wrong approach. What we need to do is address our own housing problems that we created as a city by making it too hard to create housing. We need more housing, and we need to make it easier to create housing.
Do you think you can put too much of an emphasis on demanding from developers a certain percentage of affordable units?
So I think it's important for developers to contribute to affordable housing and also to transit. I authored the legislation that for the first time requires residential developments, to pay transit impact fees. That's incredibly important. But developers, through their fees, can't solve on its own our housing crisis. Ultimately, we as a city have to take responsibility, and I've done that by authoring legislation to allow for new in-law units, or legislation to make it easier to build student housing, or legislation to allow for smaller studios, so-called micro units, or to relax density and to increase heights. We as a city have to take responsibility for our housing problems.
Both of you have been running ads, or ads have been running on your behalf. We're going to take a look at from each of you, and we'll start with one from that was run on your behalf, Scott, called See Jane Run. Let's take a look.
See Jane Kim support affordable housing. See Jane support projects with no affordable housing. See Jane Kim support the Twitter tax break. See Jane oppose it.
So Scott Wiener, I know that ad wasn't run by your campaign, but it was run on your behalf by Equality California, and it ends up by saying that Jane Kim, why does she betray her values? Do you think that she betrays her values?
First of all, I'm proud to have Equality California's support. It's the second largest LGBT civil rights organization in the country, and EQCA has prioritized my race as a gay man. I've had my own critiques of Supervisor Kim.
But do you stand by that ad? I mean, does she betray her values?
That's not my ad. I've criticized Supervisor Kim for opposing the soda tax, or for not supporting legislation to stop Academy of Art University from cannibalizing rent-controlled housing stock, or for supporting tents on sidewalks.
Do you think is that an unfair charge then?
Those are my criticisms, and I can only speak for myself. It's not my ad. I will speak for my ads, which I stand by. And Supervisor Kim and I have had many debates, and we've talked about our differences of opinion. And to me, that's what it's about as a candidate.
And Jane Kim, you have been criticized for whatever you want to call it, flip-flopping on Ross Mercury. You were against him, you were for him, you were against him. Twitter tax breaks. Is that an unfair accusation that you are a kind of finger in the wind politician?
I'm not a one-dimensional elected official, and if people want to see someone who is simplistic, then I'm probably not the right elected for them. But if you read my statements on affordable housing, on the sheriff, on what are tax exclusion for our companies, you'll see that I've actually been very consistent. Around the sheriff decision, I was very clear about the fact that I don't think 11 elected officials have a lot of purview to remove another elected official. The city charter is very clear. If voters give you the job, voters should take it away. And I said that day, I didn't believe the city charter allowed the Board of Supervisors to remove the sheriff. But if the voters want to do a recall, that I would be happy to support it, because I had also lost faith in him as one of our elected leaders. So I was actually very consistent on that front. I have never supported a project without affordable housing. But there are cases in some projects where we can get more affordable housing off-site than we can on-site. Yeah. And so in those cases, I will support those projects, because the net effect is more affordable housing for more middle and working class families here in San Francisco.
Okay, let's take a look at another ad. This is from your campaign, Jane, and it has to do with landlords and tenants. Let's take a look.
He wants you to believe he's done something to stop evictions. He hasn't. Wiener opposed stronger protection for renters. He wants you to believe he isn't in the pocket of landlords. He is, and he said he was proud of their support.
Jane Kim, you're saying this man is in the pocket of landlords. Is that what you mean?
What I am saying is that when you look at the money that has come into this race, we have seen over $700,000 come in from realtors and speculators that opposed the 2002 and 2006 affordable housing bond here in San Francisco, and have opposed Ellis Act reforms in Sacramento. Now, my opponent will say that his supporters don't represent all of his values, and I think that that's a fair statement on his part. But those individuals and entities have certainly decided who they feel will best represent their interests in Sacramento.
Scott?
There's definitely a lot of outside money that's come into this race. About $250,000 from the soda industry has come in to attack me and support Supervisor Kim, because I'm a fighter for the soda tax. She opposes it. In terms of rent control, first of all, Senator Mark Leno, the champion for Ellis Act reform, has endorsed me. I have been a strong supporter of Ellis Act reform. I authored legislation to extend rent control to new in-law units. I authored legislation to extend rent control to long-term HIV survivors with federal housing subsidies who didn't have rent control.
There is a perception, fair or not, and I'll ask you to answer it, that you're a little conservative by San Francisco standards. You're a little even maybe cold-hearted when dealing with like tents, the homeless, that kind of thing, renters. What's your response to that?
Yeah, that's we all get caricatured in politics, and that is absolutely true in terms of how some people characterize me. That is not at all accurate. To call me conservative is, honestly, it's laughable. I authored legislation to ensure universal health care coverage for transgender people, legislation to expand water recycling and require developers to put solar panels on their units, to extend rent control. I'm not sure in what universe someone could be considered conservative with that record. And in terms of being cold-hearted, I co-sponsor the ballot measure on the ballot this year that will provide $50 million a year to permanently house homeless people. Every year in the budget, I deliver funding to get homeless youth off the street, to expand meal programs. I care deeply about people living on our streets, but it's not humane or progressive to let people live in tents on sidewalks.
You mentioned earlier, Jane, that it's important to send a progressive voice, a liberal voice. But, as he suggests, by any standard, by a statewide standard, you're both liberal. You're going to go up to Sacramento, and you're not going to be one of 11 like you are now. You're going to be one of 40 in the state Senate. And you may have to work with conservative Democrats who support, get money from the tobacco industry, or maybe even support gun rights, or the oil industry. How do you envision working with people who aren't progressive? Because it's not going to be like San Francisco.
So, over the last 2 years, in 2014 and 2015, my office actually passed more legislation than any member of this Board of Supervisors, and I did that without a 6-vote progressive majority. This is actually the first year I've had a 6-vote progressive majority on the Board of Supervisors. And so I have been able to work across the aisle, and I have been able to win votes along our more moderate or conservative
But again,
elements on the
it's
Board
going
of
to be a
Supervisors.
different story up in Sacramento, right? I mean, you might need actual Republicans, which don't really exist in San Francisco on the Board of Supervisors.
But what I'm saying is that over my 10 years on the Board of Education and Board of Supervisors, I have been able to pass a lot of legislation, and I've only been able to do that by crossing over and being able to partner with other people that may not necessarily completely agree with me. I am someone that is incredibly progressive in terms of my values. I fight for our renters. I fight for our working and middle class residents. I fought to raise our minimum wage to $15 an hour. I was only able to do that by crossing over and walking across the aisle and working with folks that may not agree with me. You don't pass major legislation without more broad-based support.
Scott, how do you envision it being different in Sacramento, passing legislation, getting it to the governor's desk, than it is now at the Board of Supervisors?
It's complicated. You're running a gauntlet to get good progressive legislation through in Sacramento. But it's interesting. When Mark Leno was on the Board of Supervisors, they said he was conservative, that he was not progressive enough. And he, of course, has gone on to be a progressive champion in Sacramento. And he understands how to thread that needle and work with people that don't agree with you and get legislation through. I've always been able to partner with my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors who don't agree with me, with John Avalos, with David Campos, with Eric Marr. And I'll continue to do that. To me, it's about never personalizing it. You can disagree intensely, but never making it personal, because you never know when you need someone's vote the next day.
I'd like each of you to say what you admire in each other. Jane, start with you.
I would say that Scott is someone who always stands up, and he takes actually very hard positions, and they're not always very popular. And as someone who also serves in public office, I will never, neg on that, because I know how hard it is to stand up in front of people and not always tell them what they want to hear. And that's something I've seen Scott do before.
Yeah. Scott, what about you?
Well, I will say I have really admired Supervisor Kim's work on pedestrian safety and street safety. And her district, South of Market, because of decisions made many years ago, has some very dangerous streets in South of Market, in the Tenderloin, and a lot of vulnerable pedestrians, seniors, people with disabilities. And Jane has really, she has been a real fighter for pedestrian safety, and we've been able to partner on some pedestrian safety issues. It's an area where we're in, complete alignment.
All right, 24 days to the election. May the best person win. Jane Kim. Scott Wiener, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.